we're going to need to channel more and more human ingenuity and more human brain and power, human power into solving this crisis as we get closer and closer to unsustainable levels of warming. So in that sense, I think that there's going to be more capital than ever over the next 10 years around climate innovation and climate technology because the problem is getting worse.
Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today we've got a great guest with Manik Suri, the founder and CEO of a refrigeration, IoT, and software company, Therma. Manik started his career consistently winning as he was on top of his class at Harvard, went on to work with one of the leading clean energy investors, D.E. Shaw, then onto the Obama administration, and eventually decided to become an entrepreneur. There's a lot of great content in this episode, but in particular, he offers a lot of great insight for raising and the methodology that he recommends. In particular, the thread of choosing the right investors came up again, this time in the context of if you want to spend less time raising, find the right investors who are aligned. Overall, a really great episode. If you're here just for the business stuff, skip ahead to around 14 minutes into the show. Enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the show, Manik. How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm great. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Really excited to have you. I think this is going to be a pretty interesting conversation. But I guess let's just start from the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your backstory and how you got interested in climate tech.
Yeah, I didn't imagine I'd be running a climate tech startup when I was a kid. I first heard about climate change when I was in college. It was a problem that I imagined was a problem for the distant future. Uh, my senior year, there was a movie that came out, An Inconvenient Truth, that Al Gore had made, and I watched the film. And he actually came and gave a talk at Harvard College when I was graduating, and I thought, wow, that's terrible, but that's something my grandkids are going to have to worry about. Fast forwarding a few years later, I started working in government and saw that sustainability was becoming a much bigger problem, and not many people were working on it from the private sector side. So I left the White House. I did a short stint there in the Obama administration and started working on tech around safety, sustainability, and governance. And it kind of came full circle a few years ago. I grew up in California in the Central Valley and moved back to California in 2015. And there were just a series of weather events and wildfires that started happening every year, year after year, between the wildfires in the wine country, and then wildfires near my parents' house, 30 miles from my home where I grew up. It started becoming really clear that this wasn't just a problem, for people far away around the world or for the distant future. This was very much a here and now kind of problem. So I guess it got personal for me a few years ago, but I was interested in the problem, probably about a decade ago. And that's kind of the high level. Happy to talk more about Therma and the company I run. But yeah, I guess I would say it's an interest and a problem area that feels very relevant. And then the last thing I'll add is I have a baby, my first kid, who is a year and a half. And I think having a kid has also made it feel like a problem that's important for me to work on, because I really do want to leave the world, slightly better than I found it for my daughter Arya and future generations.
hmm Yeah, I think we'll talk about maybe the origin of the technology in a bit, but I'd be keen to just kind of dive right into what's the problem you're solving. So talk to us about the problem specifically, and then we'll go into the solution.
Yeah. Well, we're working on a sector around cooling, refrigeration, and air conditioning that has a lot of inefficiency. We work with companies that spend a lot of money on energy, around these assets, spend huge amounts on electricity for cooling, which is important because cooling makes it possible for guests to have, convenience and comfort. It makes it possible for people to live and operate, and it also makes it possible for products, food, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, biologics to get to billions of people. So cooling is critical for humanity, but cooling both causes, uses a lot of electricity and then also causes a lot of emissions. So it causes emissions in the form of refrigerants leaking, energy consumed, and spoilage of product and inventory. And in total, cooling is responsible for nearly 10% of global warming, which is kind of a crazy number. And ironically, cooling is becoming more necessary the more the planet warms, but it's also causing more warming. And so it's this vicious feedback loop that we need we need more cooling as the planet gets warmer, and it's also causing the problem. So that's the problem area we're working in.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel. And then, so can you talk a little bit more specifically about the problems for, because if I understand correctly from my research, you focus on helping commercial kitchens a lot as one of the kind of key market areas. So could you talk more about their problem in particular?
Yeah, we work largely with folks in food and food service. So restaurants, cafes, bars, schools, universities, hotels, amusement parks, hospitals, anywhere where food is served and sold. Most of the businesses that operate, in that ecosystem and those industries, they're spending lots of money on cooling every day and every year. A combination of refrigeration and air conditioning. They're also seeing loss of product because sometimes the equipment fails and goes down and they don't know about it. And when that happens, they end up having to throw out product. They end up having to trigger repair and replace cycles, spend money on maintenance or parts, and also even capital expenditure on these big expensive pieces of equipment. And so there's just a lot of cost around managing these assets, whether it's to power them or to prevent them from breaking down. And we're trying to help those businesses run more efficiently by reducing the number of times equipment fails, catching issues early and often, and lowering the energy bill 10% a month.
Hmm. Could you talk about, before we get into the solution to that, a little bit more about the specific problem of kind of energy surcharges? I don't know what the specific terminology is, but why it gets more expensive for them if they're charging running their cooling when they shouldn't be, or whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. So, electricity bills have a series of incentives and structures that basically reflect what's going on in the energy markets and for utilities more broadly. Um, a couple of things that business owners don't often realize. One, time of use rates vary. So electricity doesn't cost the same at all times of the day or at all days in the week. It's cheaper during certain periods and more expensive in other periods. And if you're thinking about air conditioning or refrigeration, most people aren't taking advantage of the time of use rate differences. They're not necessarily cooling at the best possible time. They're cooling when they think of it, or often with refrigeration, they're just cooling consistently. It's always on. It's always plugged in. So they're really not optimizing these pieces of equipment by moving the electricity use from an expensive time of use rate to a cheaper time of use rate. So that's one area where business owners generally aren't, doing much optimization. The second is utilities charge a tax on the electricity bill. And that tax is basically charged on the business's use of electricity at the peak moment of use. So what the utility does is it says, we're going to take your utilization over a billing cycle. We're going to look at the maximum utilization and we're going to take that value and charge a tax on it. That tax is called a demand charge, but the words don't really matter. The idea is that they're putting a tax on that. And the reason is because they don't know when the business is going to have its peak use. It could happen any time of the billing cycle. If every business had their peak at the same moment, the utility would need to have that much power available to provide. And so because they don't know when businesses are going to use their majority of their power and the peak of their power, as a way to spread the cost of that out, they charge a tax on the bill. Now, what that means is that a business can actually save a lot of money on their bill simply by lowering the peak. Lowering the peak reduces the tax, the charge, significantly. And that's a way to really dramatically reduce your bill without having to lower total consumption. It also helps the utility because the utility doesn't need to have that peak amount available. And that reduces the need to have special backup power plants available. Those
Hmm.
backup power plants are expensive and dirty. They're called peaker plants, and they typically use diesel or coal. So they can turn on instantly and provide extra power if a utility is running out of power, but they're expensive and dirty. They're the most emittive type of
Hmm.
power available. So we're basically helping businesses reduce their peak, and by doing that, lowering the tax. In addition, we're helping them move the electricity use from expensive to cheaper time of use rates around. Um,
Hmm.
and then in some cases, we're actually reducing the total power used. There's sometimes you just don't need to run things. For example, if a business is shut, or if a business isn't operating, or an organization is, out of a season, they don't necessarily need to run at full tilt. We've got over 1,000 schools, K through 12, that are customers. Well, schools are closed several months of the year. Um, Historically, no one's ever turned, refrigeration in the school cafeterias off when school's out. That's
Mm.
just, not a kind of technology that existed. Assets were always plugged in the wall and kept going, continuously. Refrigeration's been run dumb for 100 years. So those are low hanging fruit. When it's
Yeah.
not being utilized, you can tap it or lower it.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Okay, cool. So then I guess let's talk a little bit about the solution then. So, what part of the value chain are you adding to here? Is it a software play? Is there hardware? Just talk to us about the solution and how you're actually achieving all of those things.
Yeah, it's kind of three layers to the Therma solution. There's a hardware layer, there's a software layer, and then there's data science. So we think of the hardware as, kind of the appendages, if you will, the arms and the feet. If you imagine it as kind of a human body, we've got sensors and we've got controls. Those allow us to see what's going on around the temperature, the humidity, and the energy consumption. So we can see the real-time temperature, humidity, and energy consumption. The second layer is the ability to transmit that data to the customer and to our intelligence. That's the software layer. That's mobile and web applications. With the mobile and web applications, customers can track issues, say sometimes the temperature might go out of range. They can trigger a repair replace cycle. They can catch a piece of equipment before it fails. In some cases, they'll see electricity use going up and they can say, okay, this is a good time to optimize and actually lower utilization manually. But really, the most powerful part of the system is the third layer, which is the data science. We think of that as the brain. The power is the organism. The intelligence, the data science, basically automates the turn up and turn down for refrigeration and air conditioning, and turns things up and down in response to energy price, utilization, and what's going on with the product and the guest. So the temperature around these pieces of inventory and these pieces of equipment. And the intelligence basically decides, okay, we're going to turn things up a little bit, turn them down a little bit, create savings here. So those are the three layers. The controls and sensors is really hardware. The software, which is mobile and web applications, and then data science, which is intelligence.
Hmm. Okay, got it. So then when you come into a business, what does it look like? The setup time, the cost, what are they saving? How does the model work for them from a financial perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. We try to keep it really simple to the end customer. So the idea here is the business owner is basically purchasing what they see as a kind of software subscription. The software subscription gives them access to our mobile and web applications, and it gives them access to our hardware, though they're not buying the hardware. They're getting a lease on the hardware for the period of the subscription. And as a result of installing this solution, they're getting savings, both in the form of food waste and spoilage prevented, an alarm system for their inventory, early warning signs of equipment failing. That gives them repair and maintenance cycles and helps them catch issues and extend the asset life, and savings on their utility bill. And we're essentially guaranteeing a 10% saving on their electricity bill. So three things: they're getting alarm for their inventory to reduce food waste and loss, equipment insights that help extend the asset life, and then 10% savings in electricity bill.
Hmm. So you're guaranteeing that basically, like you pay the subscription, and then that overall is going to reduce your even that cost included is going to reduce your bill. Okay, interesting.
Exactly.
Interested. Okay, very cool. So it's pretty straightforward. I mean, maybe not so straightforward, probably pretty complicated, but like in terms of the solution, some hardware to track what's going on, and then interacting with utility data and what they're doing to ultimately save the money from repairs and head things off of the past rather than, oh my gosh, we just lost the fridge and we're gonna lose everything in it and probably cost us several thousand, right? Especially for a big kitchen, and probably not an easy situation. I'm trying to think when I worked in food service, I was a waiter way back. I don't think our fridge ever or our refrigerator unit ever went out. Thankfully, that'd have been a disaster. But anyways, this is really interesting. So I guess the fun part for me now is I want to get to the kind of to the origin of this. Like, where did you come up with the idea to specifically do this? I mean, I'm assuming you weren't, at Harvard dreaming, what, I want to work in refrigeration someday. Like
I was
what
not.
how did you come up with this idea specifically? Where'd you find the technology? What's the origin?
Yeah, I think it was a, organic process, no pun intended. Definitely, one thing led to another. I was always interested in doing work, at the intersection of public problems and the private sector. I think that interest came right out of college. I studied political science and economics. I started my career as an investor. So I worked doing private equity, early stage investing at DE Shaw from '06 to 9, and worked on clean tech. So I worked with a group that invested in clean coal, offshore wind, solar. D. Shaw was one of the largest renewables and energy investors in the 2000s. And I worked for the gentleman who ran the firm. And so I got exposure to clean tech as an investor, decided to go to government and went back to law school. So worked in the White House briefly and worked, around sustainability and governance. Never thought I'd work in refrigeration, but my parents had moved when I was a kid to a small town in California called Fresno, right between LA and San Francisco. It's right in the middle of the state. And my parents had left New York in the 80s and decided they wanted a small town life with no snow and no commute. So we moved to this ag town called Fresno. I had walnut farms behind my house, olives down the road, palms and peach trees around the corner, like really an ag town, a breadbasket. And so fast forwarding, after leaving government, I started a center at MIT and NYU called the Gov Lab to build tech for good with the former deputy CTO. Did that for a couple of years and then decided to start a company. And when I was looking at safety and sustainability and trying to figure out, okay, where should I work? Which industries have problems around safety and sustainability? And right around that time, Chipotle was dealing with a bunch of food safety issues. They were in the news a lot. The brand was falling. Market cap was down 42% because of food safety and quality problems in their supply chain. And I remember thinking, like, I can't believe a big company like Chipotle, which is pretty sophisticated, pretty modern, is struggling with these supply chain issues, and with food safety. How can that be? And I'd gone to visit my parents in Fresno over the holidays, and we have a bunch of family friends who are in food, growers, distributors. And I remember one of them saying to me, no one from Silicon Valley comes to San Joaquin Valley. Like, it's an hour away, but no one crosses the mountains and comes over here and talks to us or sells us anything. And, that was kind of when I started thinking about working in food, farm to fork. So that was 2015. And I started the precursor to Therma, a company called Co-Inspect, to basically build product and digitize workflow in the food supply chain from farm to fork. And we started replacing pen and paper with mobile apps. The Co-Inspect was a mobile app to digitize workflow around safety and quality. Well, we scaled Co-Inspect from 16 to 19 to about 5,000 locations. And in the process, we realized we were solving the right problem the wrong way. Most of what users were checking was temperature, and they were checking the temperature of the product to make sure it stayed in the right zones, which is important for safety and quality in food. But we were replacing a paper and pen clipboard with a digital clipboard, and people still had to check this stuff manually. They were just doing it on a mobile app or a tablet, and that wasn't that much better. Like, it wasn't actually making their work that much easier. So we started thinking about ways to improve the UX UI of this first product, and we realized in the summer of 2019 it would be just much better to automate it and use sensors to create continuous monitoring. Instead of a mobile app that required people to do this work, what if a sensor could just automate it entirely? So we started working on a second product called Therma, and Therma is short for temperature, humidity, energy, remote monitoring application, team of nerds.
Nice.
And
That's
the
a good one.
idea
That's a
was
good one.
so we thought, okay, well, what if a sensor could just eliminate the need for people to check this stuff in the first place? And we launched Therma in the world in late 19, and the uptick was incredible, much faster than co-inspect. And a lot of our early customers were co-inspect users, and they said, oh, this actually makes our life easier. Now we don't have to check stuff. It's doing it for us, and we're catching equipment failure and food waste. So it's not just about compliance and safety, it's actually reducing food waste and asset failure. So it's got a sustainability orientation. Plus, it's creating ROI for us. So the adoption of Therma was way faster, and we started growing really quickly in early 20. And we ultimately pivoted the company, rebranded and relaunched as Therma in early 2020, right around the time the pandemic hit. And that's how I ended up in the cold chain and refrigeration.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. So I guess one thing I'm just kind of curious about is like, did you always want to build your own company? Was that something you had kind of in the back of your mind way early on in your life?
I didn't. I never thought I'd be an entrepreneur, honestly. I was really interested in government and public impact and having some kind of pro-social positive impact. That was important to me. Um, I came from a family and come from a family of people that are really focused on service. My parents, most of my family is in healthcare. My
Mm.
parents are both doctors. My brother's a doctor. My wife is a physician. Um, Three of my grandparents are doctors. And
Wow,
both of my
nice.
grandfathers, yeah, my great grandfather is a doctor. Even I've just learned this recently. He served in World War One and World War Two in the British Army in India.
Wow.
Um, so I came, yeah, both my grandparents, both my grandfathers were physicians in the army in India. So, a lot of service, just the idea was you got to do good in the world. You got to do more than just make money. That was just part of our culture in the family. And so I studied political science and I went to work in finance and then I got into government. I never really wanted to be an entrepreneur per se, but I realized that technology could really have a positive impact and it could scale really quickly if you built the right tech. That got me excited. And when Beth Novick, the former deputy CTO of the White House, when she convinced me that we could build tech for good, that's when I started thinking, okay, maybe there's an opportunity to do this at scale. And I guess the credit for becoming an entrepreneur goes to inspiration from others. My dad became a self-made business person. He started his own practice, left academia, left Columbia. He was a doctor at Columbia in Manhattan, and left the prestige and the influence of academia to move to a small town. Um, and kind of built his own practice up. So I guess I got inspired by seeing his example, but also seeing what the power of technology at scale could be. And yeah, that's how I guess I fell
Mhm.
into entrepreneurship.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious, so it's really interesting that you've actually worked in a number of different industries. You worked in finance and private equity in one of the biggest investors in that kind of clean tech 1.0, which is again really focused on energy, as I understand. Obviously, I wasn't really in the space at the time, but so that kind of maybe gave you some idea. And then you worked in government a bit. I'm kind of curious how when you're looking back, how those two different experiences really shaped you think, how you ended up picking this problem to solve in particular.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I feel like each of these experiences has been valuable in helping shape some of the work I'm doing today. I think, for all of us, our life kind of builds, right? All the choices we make end up stacking on each other. And, I think we learn and connect concepts in ways you can't imagine. Um, I think, working as an investor as my first job, I got a sense of how capital allocation works. I got to listen to a bunch of investment committee decisions. I got to invest. I worked on several deals, and got to put capital to work. And so I think that exposure to how investors think, and frankly, the network I built. I worked at one of the biggest funds in the world, for the gentleman who ran the firm. He became one of our first investors at Therma. Half my friends are VCs or PE guys at this point, and women. Just kind of happened because of the choices I made. I think working in the White House and then going to Harvard twice, it happens. So I know a lot of investors, and that's been valuable. Raising capital as an entrepreneur, it's helpful to know how investors think and to be able to get connected to the right firms and funds. But I think I had no idea what it was like to be an entrepreneur. Being an entrepreneur in many ways is much harder than being an investor. So I think it was humbling. The government experience, I think what I took away from that, I mean, many things were great about working at the National Economic Council as a junior guy, but two things that stand out today. One, I came to appreciate that there are many sources of capital and many ways in which you can build organizations at scale. And I think in climate innovation, specifically in climate tech, companies need to utilize different sources of capital. Equity dollars are relevant and important for certain things. Um, Debt can be really valuable for scaling in other ways, and government funding, tax credits, subsidies, and grants can be valuable as well. In especially early stage R&D and technology scaling in the climate movement, where it's not just high margin, software. We're not building photo sharing apps here. So I think that you have to really understand how to leverage different sources of capital, and working in government and also as an investor, gave me some sense of the different sources of capital and different costs of capital and ways to think about constructing a balance sheet, in ways that I wouldn't have had, if I just gone straight into being a tech entrepreneur. And then I think there's lots of partnership opportunity. Right now we're talking to Department of Energy, we're talking to state, leaders in California and other places. And some of those relationships and understanding how people think, it's helpful sometimes to had a chance to see it from their side, because then you realize that people might speak different languages in different sectors, but many times they're working on the same thing. And if you can kind of translate between sectors, you can
Hmm.
you can have real impact.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Some things I've heard recently on some of the shows I listen to is it's something I sort of knew, but it's kind of a good reminder is that there's a lot of unspoken rules in every industry and how things work, and then sometimes it's important to know what those rules are so you don't accidentally step on somebody's toe and upset them, especially when you're trying to get funding for something. I'm curious. You mentioned the kind of the credit space. Are restaurants or organizations that use your technology able to take advantage of some of these things, kind of from carbon abatement?
Yeah, they are, but it's not a kind of necessarily one-to-one. I think there's two ways in which they may be able to benefit. One, there are certainly um, incentives and in some cases credits or subsidies around installing energy efficiency upgrades and more effective equipment and assets. So in that sense, there's a potential direct benefit. The other, I think, more powerful or at least equally powerful opportunity is there's a lot of interest right now in installing or implementing or deploying solutions that actually help businesses achieve net zero commitments or emissions reduction commitments. And a lot of these companies have made commitments publicly. So they're very much looking for ways to fulfill those
Mhm.
obligations or those promises. And I think they see that as good for their shareholder, uh, you know, um, value long term. They see it as important for their customers and marketing as being a kind of a positive force in the world, and a product or brand that customers should want to frequent. And I think they see it as a necessary part of evolving. So we work with operators of brands like McDonald's, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Burger King, Domino's, Marriott, Wyndham, Hilton, 7-Eleven, and others. These are companies often that are very focused on operating efficiency that can also achieve positive ESG, especially in
Mhm.
today's economy. So yeah, I see that as another big win for deploying this kind of tech, is the kind of ability to just actually deliver on the promise and market it.
Yeah, I think that is a big thing. I've noticed a lot right now is that because there's so much interest in from the consumer side of actually purchasing more, sustainable products or going to better people who are being better stewards of the resources, they can get more business, right? Obviously, at some point, I mean, the dream is that everybody will be doing that for the most part. So it'll really just be a kind of a negative tack on anybody who's not. But in the
Right.
meantime, there may be kind of a competitive advantage to that. When you started, you mentioned that you started and then you pivoted. So if I understand correctly, the first part of the business was in some ways more of a, was it still a software model or was it more of a services model?
Software model. Well, let me make sure I'm understanding the part you're talking about. Are you talking about co-inspect before we became
Yeah,
Therma?
yeah.
Yeah, co-inspect we sold on a SaaS basis, as a mobile app, and it was essentially, and it's still in use across several thousand locations. So we do have an installed base. It's a subscription-based product, and it's basically a mobile uh safety and quality management tool to help businesses
Okay.
operate more.
Yeah, so I was just because I want to make sure I understood that because the next question I have is around the funding process. So you obviously you mentioned you had a number of existing relationships with investors, but could you maybe talk to especially for founders listening who are specifically building a product that's kind of IoT plus software, what you would recommend they look out for when they're going on the fundraising trail? What are the key metrics that they need to hit in the beginning when they're getting started off the very beginning? To then get some traction and get funding. Just walk us through that process and your recommendations there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think raising capital is hard, and many people describe it as a full-time job, and I don't disagree. I think it's one of those skills and one of those functions that is essential, though, it sometimes feels like a distraction from building a business. And I think I learned a lot by making just about every mistake you can make, raising capital. Just like I think, all of us learn from our mistakes often more than our successes. Um, Super humbling. I went into raising capital for the first round we raised, um, you know, uh, with no idea about how to raise money. So I was very inefficient, got rejected, 8 out of 10 times, and got used to getting a lot of no's. And I wasn't used to getting a lot of no's in my life. I'd been very successful as a student. So I kind of thought, well, if I'm a good student, I can do anything. And then I'd gotten a really prestigious job at the world's biggest investment firm. And then I got to work in the White House. And so I got comfortable with the idea that, well, people will take my meetings and of course people will take my calls. And then you go to having no capital and no product and trying to raise money. The first round we raised was a 700,000 convertible note and took me like a year and a half to raise. Um, and then our last round was a 20 million Series A, which we did in 4 months, pretty efficiently. And we raised about 35 million for Therma in the last 3 years. So still not a lot of capital by Silicon Valley standards, but I've gotten more comfortable with raising capital over, multiple tranches and multiple efforts. One of the best pieces of advice I got was to treat fundraising like a sales process and to build a funnel, to create a lead list to aggressively disqualify folks from that lead list and aggressively pursue the remaining folks and to treat it truly like a sales process. So I started using a tool called Founder Suite, kind of a simple CRM for fundraising. There's many out there. Founder Suite was fine, but a Google spreadsheet works pretty well. I actually used a Google spreadsheet for our last raise. It worked just as well. And you can basically start creating a universe of targets pretty quickly. There's lots of good resources out there, in terms of, lists of investors, lists of possible partners. But I think the hard part is then narrowing that list and deciding, okay, who's really a good fit for me and what I'm building. And that is very personal and very specific. Some of it is about stage. If you're pitching an early stage opportunity that's pre-product to a fund or a firm or a group that only invests in scaling, and growing existing business lines, it's going to be a pretty hard battle. And similarly, if you're selling, the dream, around growth stage, where you've got traction and you're looking for ways to scale that, to a fund that only has small checks to write and typically looks pre-product or pre-seed or seed, they probably aren't going to be able to do much, or they're going to write you such a small check, it's going to take forever to close a round. So getting the stage fit right is part of the filter. The other thing is to get the sector and thesis fit right. And that's another area, in the beginning when I was first raising capital, I didn't really think about that. I just assumed I would talk to everyone who had money and figure out like, well, who was a fit. There's lots of ways to efficiently get a sense of who is potentially a good fit by just reading about who they've invested in, or look at some of their website materials or their online content. Most decent investors will publish something about their investment thesis, their mandate, the kinds of things they care about. So that can give you a good sense of whether the group or the individual or the fund or firm is interested in the kind of stuff that you're interested in as an entrepreneur. And that can disqualify a lot of people. So I think my kind of the top line message I would say is treat it like a sales process. That'll help reduce the amount of time it takes. I think if I'd treated our first round with more rigor, I could have shortened the fundraise from 18 months to maybe 6 months. Because I would have just not talked to a whole bunch of people that I ended up talking to that were never going to be a fit, no matter what I did differently, because they just weren't, either stage or sector oriented. Another piece of advice I would give is to get early feedback and refine. I think I've done 400 or 500 pitches by now, over the, 35-ish, million we've raised. But the last round I did, you know, a fifth number of pitches of the first round. So many fewer pitches. And my hit ratio was way higher. Part of the reason the hit ratio was higher was filters, focusing on the right potential partners, not everybody I could possibly get a meeting with. But the other reason I think the hit ratio got better was I started getting better, and I'm still, I wouldn't say I'm exceptional at this. I'm just, learning as I go. And this is another piece of advice I got from successful entrepreneurs around me. Get feedback and internalize that feedback. That feedback could be on the pitch, on the product, on the team, on the vision, on the market, or go to market. Take the feedback and actually improve your business or change your business. One of the best things about fundraising, um, and there's many things about it that are painful and not that fun, but one of the best things about it is I think if you treat it as an opportunity to learn, you can actually improve your business. You can pick up tons of good advice, whether that's a way of thinking about unit economics that might make you more effective and profitable over time, or a way of thinking about supply chain that might make you, less, exposed, or a way to think about go to market that might make you more efficient at scaling, or a whole bunch of other things. A way to think about competitors that might make you differentiated and distinguish. So I think if you can take feedback from a small group of trusted and friendlies, and then start iterating from there, the chances of getting to yes will increase with each rep. And I think that that's another way to shorten the process and get to more effective, results. And then the last thing I would say is, just be committed, hustle. It's definitely a grind. It doesn't, have to be, I think, for everybody. There are some people that are, able to raise money, it seems, without having to leave their living room and without having to do too many pitches. But for most of us, you have to go out there and sell the dream. And I think the hardest thing for me, honestly, Silas, was getting comfortable with rejection. I was a straight A student. I was valedictorian in my high school, top of my class at Harvard College. I was not used to no, and I was not used to failing. Like I just wasn't used to experiencing rejection. And once I became an entrepreneur, I had no capital. I bootstrapped the business initially. I got mostly rejected by almost every investor I talked to. People were like, "You're working on food and you're trying to make safety better and sustainability. Um, good luck with that." And my wife jokes that I like to raise money at the worst times. That was co-inspect. The first round I raised for Therma was in March of 2020. I had a new
Nice.
product, selling it to restaurants as the world was shutting down forever. So most people I knew, and I know lots of investors, were like, "You're awesome. Good luck with that." No, thank you. Uh, and then the last round we raised was last summer and fall when the world tech valuations fell 40 to 80%. And people were like, "Still love you, good luck with your Series A. So, I think raising money is always hard. I've seemed to have figured out how to pick the worst times to start raising capital. But I do think if you kind of stay committed and get disciplined about it, and take the feedback, either you'll pull it off, or you may learn not every business is, meant for venture capital, and that's okay. Venture capital is not the best way to build every organization. It's good for certain things,
Mhm.
but not for everything.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. So I was going to ask you about that because, it looks like you've closed around in February, right? This year.
We announced it in February. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
We did a rolling close, but that's right.
Yeah, so I mean, because obviously right now there's a lot of talk about whether or not the VCs are going to get more, because there's a lot of capital to be deployed still. I think they're just a little bit more selective on where they're deploying it now. But there's a lot of talk about the LPs not wanting to put up money. I think it was congruent, if I'm not mistaken, just raising another 300 million. So it's like a good sign. But I don't know precisely. I'm just kind of keen to get your maybe macro thoughts, if you have any in particular, on the space, and whether or not there are any kind of fundamental issues or threats to the startups that do are going to need money, in the next 6 months, 18 months, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ink that's being spilled on the topic by people who are, I think, very thoughtful and have a very deep, I think, global macro view, as well as folks from the sector thinking about this problem. I don't have a crystal ball, so it's just a single data point. But I guess a few thoughts, just high level. One, I do think that markets are in a more, um, you know, um, cautious and careful stance. Investors, public and private, are definitely feeling skittish, and as a result, I think that's put a lot of pressure on valuations and on sizes of raise. I think that's just one of those cyclical phenomena that happens from time to time, and lots of factors, geopolitics, fiscal issues, and concerns about inflation, a whole bunch of reasons why. Um, but I think if you take a longer, so I do think if you're raising money in the next few months, one has to factor that in. That might mean being more, willing to compromise on valuation, or consider taking less capital, or taking it, on less attractive terms. Um, those are all, I think, just reasonable reactions to the environment. In the same way that when capital was cheaper and easier to come by, people took deal terms that they could get on, better valuation and better, economic and governance terms. But I think on the climate innovation and climate tech, view specifically, I'm very bullish about the opportunity. I'm concerned about the problem. The problem, according to every expert in the IPCC, is getting worse, and significantly worse year over year. Um, I think what that means is we're going to need to channel more and more human ingenuity and more human brain and power, human power, into solving this crisis as we get closer and closer to unsustainable levels of warming. So in that sense, I think that there's going to be more capital than ever over the next 10 years around climate innovation and climate technology, because the problem is getting worse. What that means is I think there's going to be a need for entrepreneurship and people to get into this space, and the capital isn't going to go away. Whether the terms are slightly better or slightly worse, I can't really predict what's going to happen with the macroeconomy. Very few can, and I've worked at one of the best hedge funds in the world that's pretty good at doing well. DE Shaw is, I think, one of the best rated funds in the world, but it's still really hard to predict. No one I know is really good at it. Continuously or
Mhm.
consistently. I think what you can do is form a view about the problem area and say, okay, this is a problem area I want to work in. And there, I think there's going to be a lot of capital over time.
Yeah. I think one thing that's interesting, I mean, maybe it's not going to, obviously, I don't think it's ever going to truly fix it, because there's always this fine line that has to be walked between, um, like they've taking the big term sheets versus saying, hey, we really don't need that much, maybe we can be more efficient. I just think it's inherently important for especially climate tech companies to remember, like, what do we really need, and can we do it more efficiently, right? Because there's that money, if it doesn't go to you, can go to another company, in the space, right? And one thing I really really hope for in the hope hopefully in the near future is that they get more efficient, that the VCs get more efficient with distribution of capital, because it seems to me that usually there's a couple really good leaders in certain subsectors, and then a lot of people just follow suit because they don't really know what's going on. And I'd like to see more money go to other new technologies that might be getting kind of overlooked because they're, just not as attractive, right? They're not a software or something like that. But we need hardware to solve a lot of these problems.
I couldn't agree more. I think things are changing. And a mindset that might have worked for a certain set of problems doesn't always work for a new class of problems. The sources of global warming and the sources of emissions are, physical in nature, and so it's really hard to reduce the problem or reduce emissions um, without touching the physical world. It's just, you know, whether it's agriculture and food or transportation or buildings, or generating electricity. It's pretty hard to improve those areas with software alone, the emissions themselves. So I think there are going to be more and more people on the investment side recognizing that for this set of problems, we need solutions that might be hardware enabled. They might have services. They might have, a blended business model. They might even have some social, impact and ESG measurement built in. And so there's a lot of things I think that are different about this set of problems versus, say, scaling access to the internet or scaling access to mobile devices, or scaling access to applications that work on mobile devices. For some of those, for the opportunities that those technologies enabled, I think lots of people made a lot of money by investing in software. And software has really attractive margins. Once it's built, it's fairly effective to scale. And you can get lots of recurring long-term revenue. That made a lot of VCs happy and wealthy, and doesn't work for this set of problems as well. So yeah, I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
agree more. I think it's changing. I think there are more funds emerging, and some of the newer players and some of the existing leaders that are transitioning are recognizing we're going to need to be different to attack
Yeah.
climate.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I mean, again, I'm not by any means an expert, but from an outside perspective, it seems as though it's much more difficult to be a hardware VC, right? There's more, oftentimes it's harder to help your portfolio companies grow because it's not just the same playbook you run over and over again. You might have to try to find specific networks that you can tap into to get partnership models or whatnot. And I just think that it requires people to really like put in the deep effort to make it happen and to help their portfolio companies. So it is exciting to see. I'm really interested to see the evolution of the space. I think hardware. This is something before I ever got into tech at all. I was like, oh man, how do you? But what? How do you start a hardware company? Like you can't raise VC for a hardware company. It's gonna be difficult, right? But maybe
Yep.
there'll be new models to hopefully enable that because there's so many cool things in hardware, right? And think about the moat you can develop in a hardware business too if you do a really good job. I think that's something worth noting is a lot of these like really great cash flowing businesses that last for a very long time, hardware, right? Or something physical, right? Um, Very cool. Let's talk about, let's kind of wrap things up here. What are your, where is Therma going from here? What are you excited for in the future? And let's kind of wrap things up with what your predictions are in the near future of people in this particular space.
Yeah, I think we're obviously early stage, so life is always uncertain in startup in the startup world. But I'm excited about the capital we've raised. I'm thrilled about the team we've assembled. We're a small team, about 70 people, but we're very committed to scaling and having social impact. The team, I joke, bleeds green, but it's a very mission aligned organization. I think we're also a pretty interesting interdisciplinary group, and I love that. We've got former lawyers, refrigeration technicians, AI specialists from places like Meta. We have a physicist, who took a company public as the CTO and founder, and he's our chief technologist. He's an applied physicist who thinks of this as a geothermal problem. So just a really interesting um, you know, organization of humans working on, I think, an unsexy and necessary corner of the climate crisis, which is cooling. So, we're always looking to bring partners on board, whether that's folks that might be interested in our products, folks that might be interested in our work, or, capital partners. So if anyone's interested and wants to talk more, I'm available, on email and on online, Manik at hellotherma.com. I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn. That's Manik, Manik at hellotherma.com. But also, always excited to have folks celebrate our work, share, and build on it. So please check us out on social. We're Hello Therma. And also, thanks very much, Silas, for this great conversation.
Yeah, certainly. No, it's my pleasure. I love having people on who do cool stuff. Like I have a bit of a different background, so it's always keen to see people who can nerd out about different things. I think maybe in another life I should have been an engineer. But maybe there's still time, right? But anyways, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been great.
Pleasure. Well, really nice to chat. Look forward to staying in touch. Check out our work and talk again soon.
All right, sounds great.